Starting shortly on Channel 4, more drama on the streets of an American precinct with Hill Street Blues. But now on Central, the national and international news at 10 o'clock.
Lord Whitelaw, the Deputy Prime Minister, has a stroke. 1,000 new Nissan car jobs, 2 views. Mr. Gorbachev insists we must both ratify the arms treaty. A doctor says I wouldn't have backed the Tories if I'd known. And the Duke admits she learned in half the time. Good evening. Lord Whitelaw, the Deputy Prime Minister and Leader of the House of Lords, is in hospital in London tonight after collapsing at the annual parliamentary carol service. The hospital says he's had a slight stroke, but his condition is improving. Mrs. Thatcher is said to be very concerned. She sent a letter to the hospital this evening with her best wishes for a speedy recovery. Lord Whitelaw's 69. He collapsed in his pew at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster, just after reading one of the lessons. The hospital now says his condition is stable.
Lord Whitelaw had just read one of the lessons at a service here at St. Margaret's, Westminster tonight, just across the road from Parliament and regarded as its own parish church. He'd resumed his seat when he felt ill. He was attended to by a doctor who was also at the carol service, and at the end of the service, he was taken from the church in a wheelchair to Westminster Hospital, where he was admitted as an emergency patient and where a hospital spokesman gave this report on his condition.
Yes, Lord Whitelaw was taken ill at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster, this evening. He's been admitted to Westminster Hospital, where his condition is stable. No further statement will be issued until 9:30 a.m. Tuesday the 15th December.
Lady Whitelaw has been to the hospital tonight to see her husband, and there's also been a get-well letter delivered from number 10 in which Mrs. Thatcher has wished Lord Whitelaw a speedy recovery. Although he left the Commons 4 years ago, Lord Whitelaw's influence in and around Cabinet has remained formidable. That was particularly true 2 months ago, when it was his views above all, carefully leaked during the Tory conference, which scuppered the chances of Lord Young becoming party chairman. Lord Whitelaw's political reputation rests specially on his remarkable efforts at reconciliation while he was Northern Ireland Secretary. That even included at one stage a secret meeting with IRA representatives. And on his 4 years as Home Secretary during Mrs. Thatcher's first term, where his liberal conservatism still led him to introduce the short, sharp shock regime for young offenders. Mrs. Thatcher has always valued his advice, not just on the increasingly difficult business of steering government bills through the Lords, but through his annual job of sorting out public spending through the so-called Star Chamber process. But his advice hasn't always been what Mrs. Thatcher wants to hear. Lord Whitelaw's recent public remarks about the problems the new education bill may face in the Lords were no accident, but they didn't go down at all well in Downing Street. Michael Brunson, News at 10, Westminster.
The Japanese car firm Nissan is to create 1,400 new jobs in a big expansion at its Sunderland factory. The £216 million investment is to produce a new model of the Micra. It'll make Nissan Britain's third biggest car maker. The Sunderland factory has a no-strike agreement, and today Nissan's chairman said he'd been deeply impressed by the enthusiasm of workers in the northeast.
The Europeanisation of Nissan's image, as well as its product, is being cultivated with typical Japanese thoroughness. Much is made of the induction of Geordie car workers into the Oriental work ethic.
Blueboard's better over here than the deal with them.
Now he say Sunderland factory make Bluebirds even better than Tokyo.
For Mrs. Thatcher, who opened the plant officially 15 months ago, the development was a springboard for revitalising Britain's motor exports. Today, Nissan's chairman, Takashi Ishihara, heaped praise on his workforce's motivation and enthusiasm, the company maintaining that its new Mini would be very much a British car.
By the time we build that car, we'll have 80% of it local, meaning EEC. And on our present experience, 80% of that is British, so they'll be very British vehicles.
Nissan's superior productivity is unquestioned. This year, it's making 29,000 Bluebird models with 1,100 workers. By 1991, it'll make 100,000 of that model with 2,500 staff. The following year, 100,000 of the new Micra, with an even more automated process, will employ only 1,400 more. Japanese working practices contribute to this efficiency. a single union deal with an elected company council, only 4 staff grades, no demarcation, and an effectively strike-free deal. Established rival Ford, for instance, has 9 unions negotiating through a national committee for workers at 22 plants, 50 separate jobs against 500 2 years ago, and a strike weapon still very much part of the bargaining process. In the northeast, there's much cheer at the new jobs, though some say Nissan recruits from too far afield.
People from the south are coming up and they're getting the jobs, and people in the north should be getting them.
There's not even any training. I mean, they want people, you know, with a really high caliber of education.
So will more jobs at Nissan mean fewer elsewhere in Britain's motor industry?
No, maybe other parts of Europe or other parts of the world. As long as we carry on importing half our cars, there's a great deal of jobs for us to win back by producing cars in this country. And I don't care if they're Nissan, Ford, Jaguar or whatever, we want to produce them here.
The Soviet leader, Mr. Gorbachev, has told Soviet television viewers that it's too early to talk about a fundamental breakthrough in Soviet-American relations. Mr. Gorbachev, who was speaking on the evening news program Vremya, said differences over Star Wars could still stop further improvements in the superpower relationship. He thanked the Soviet people for supporting his domestic reform program. He said that without their support, the Washington summit might not have taken place. Libby Weiner at ITN reports.
The Washington summit over, Mr. Gorbachev was playing to a very different audience tonight. His message was one of caution abroad, but continued reform at home. He said the signing of the INF Treaty had created a new atmosphere, breaking down prejudices and animosity. But he warned that differences over Star Wars space research could prevent a further thaw in superpower relations.
It is too early to speak about a fundamental improvement in Soviet-American relations, but they are more constructive than before.
The issue of Star Wars failed to dampen the spirit of optimism in Washington, but tonight Mr. Gorbachev bitterly criticized those in America who are demanding the space research program be speeded up.
One can hear increasingly louder voices urging the leadership of the United States not to go too far and to halt the disarmament process.
Mr. Gorbachev's speech was broadcast at the start of the evening news, much of it clearly aimed at winning support for his reform policies at home.
Without all this, there would have been no success at the talks, and the talks themselves would hardly have taken place.
On Thursday, Mr. Gorbachev left America, looking forward to another meeting with Mr. Reagan in Moscow. Tonight, it's clear there's still much talking to be done before it can match the euphoria of Washington.
A petition from 1,000 doctors calling for more health service cash is to be handed in to Mrs. Thatcher tomorrow. One of the delegation's leaders is Mr. Nigel Harris, a consultant at St Mary's in Paddington. He says he's changed his mind since the election campaign when he shared a platform with Conservative health ministers.
The new Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother wing at St Mary's has just cost £33 million. Its surgical units were due to be opened in 3 weeks' time, but 3 of the 8 operating theatres, 3 of the 8 wards and half of the intensive care beds will stay closed for the foreseeable future because there's no money to run them. Nigel Harris, a consultant orthopaedic surgeon, was the chairman of the commissioning team for the new wing. He's saddened and angry at this waste of scarce resources. But 7 months ago, Mr. Harris sat on a Tory election platform supporting the Conservatives' pledge that the health service was safe in their hands. Does he now regret that support?
Yes, I do regret it.
Why is that?
Because now I am not able to use my clinical judgment to give the patients the best possible advice, simply due to the cuts in services.
The government said at the last election the health service was safe in their hands. Is that true?
Well, if this is allowed to continue, the answer must be no, it is not safe.
Mr. Harris may meet Mrs. Thatcher again tomorrow when he and other senior doctors hand a petition into number 10 Downing Street. Signed by 1,000 consultants and junior doctors, it warns that patients' lives are being endangered by health service cuts and shortages.
If she meets for doctors tomorrow, Mrs. Thatcher will almost certainly tell them that the National Health Service has never had as much money and that there are now more operations and more doctors and nurses than ever before. David Rose, News at 10, St Mary's.
The government insists the Chief Constable of Manchester, Mr James Anderton, is speaking only for himself when he talks about thrashing criminals. Mr Anderton's remark that he would personally thrash violent offenders until they begged for mercy is part of an interview in Woman's Own. He said today he was just repeating what he said 8 years ago.
The Chief Constable rejected calls for his resignation, saying he has said nothing new. The magazine reporter had asked him if he still held views he expressed on television several years ago, following a brutal attack on an elderly lady. This is the tape the interview is based on.
And I said, very genuinely and sincerely, and I still feel this way, that for such gratuitous acts of violence by totally undisciplined youths or young men, that corporal punishment should be administered so that they actually begged for mercy. What I was seeking to do in a perhaps old-fashioned way was to assert the right of those in authority to impose physical punishment upon people who deserve it, and that they should be punished until they repented of their sins.
Would you be the one to do the punishment too? I mean, would you?
Oh, I could do that.
Last year, he caused an outcry when he attacked homosexuals at risk from AIDS, saying they swirled in a cesspit of their own making. Now there's a new row.
I think in view of assurances that have been given in the past about Mr Anderton's conduct and the fact that he has obviously broken those assurances on this occasion, the Home Secretary will have to look at what's been said, and I'm sure that the Home Secretary and the Police Committee will want to discuss Mr Anderton's future very carefully, and I think that the sacking of Mr Anderton has to be a possibility.
The Home Office say Mr Anderton's future is a matter for the Manchester Police Authority, who meet on Friday.
The Health and Safety Executive says the Sellafield nuclear reprocessing plant can stay open even though radioactive waste is still being stored there in unsatisfactory conditions. 12 months ago, the executive said the plant would be closed unless modifications to reduce the risk of leaks were carried out without delay. The Director General of the Safety Executive, Mr John Rivington, says the plant then would have got just 4 out of 10. Today he said British Nuclear Fuels have done what we requested. We are pleased with the progress and their attitude. They now get 7 out of 10. Lawrence McGuinty from ITN's Channel 4 News reports.
All Britain's nuclear waste ends up in flasks on this train, being taken to be reprocessed in the building that's the heart of the Sellafield complex, B205. Amidst Greenpeace accusations of a whitewash, the government's nuclear watchdogs say there's heartening evidence that safety at Sellafield is improving. For example, since the safety inspector's detailed report on Sellafield a year ago, they've built this new ventilation machinery for B205, sucking any radioactive contamination in the air inside the building into filters to prevent leaks that could endanger the public. They've enclosed this pump, the source of a leak that contaminated workers last year, in a sealed box to prevent a repetition of that accident. They're building new effluent tanks because the inspectors said the old ones were too corroded to be safe.
I believe we've used every means possible to ensure that our plants will meet not just today's standards, but any future tighter standards that may be implemented.
BNFL has already spent £5.5 million on equipment like new pipes that will increase safety. But some things haven't changed since last year's tough report, like the control room, which is just as old-fashioned and confusing today as the inspectors said it was a year ago. The company has spent £2.5 million just on plans to tackle those problems. Implementing the plans will cost £42 million.
At the end of it all, what matters is the attitudes of people on sites such as this. They have to work and operate the plants in a safe manner, and we will be looking towards them to do just that.
The elections in South Korea are being made nastier and nastier. The new necessary style of campaigning, a report next. Plus, the latest better news of Lord Whitelaw's stroke. And England agrees Gatting will be captain in the next test. That's in a couple of minutes. We've just got an update from Westminster Hospital on Lord Whitelaw's condition. The hospital says he's a National Health Service patient there. He's now resting after having suffered a slight stroke.
And that has given a fluctuating weakness of his right-hand side, which is now improving. He is lying down, he's fully conscious and talking. And will obviously be retained in hospital overnight. And we will give you an update statement on his condition tomorrow morning at 9:30.
What are his spirits like? What sort of spirits is he?
He appears to be in good spirits, and Lady Whitelaw is with him, and he's just resting.
A woman suspected of sabotaging the Korean airliner which vanished over Thailand last month is reported tonight to be on her way to South Korea after being extradited from Bahrain. South Korea claims North Korea bombed the plane to disrupt Wednesday's presidential elections, which is seen as an important test of South Korea's democracy. There are three front-runners. The government's man is Mr. No Tai-woo. The retired general was hand-picked by President Chun. For the opposition, Mr. Kim Dae-jung was narrowly defeated in the 1971 elections and then spent years in custody or in exile. Much of the army view him as a communist sympathizer. Mr. Kim Young-sam is seen as a more moderate candidate and calls himself a conservative Democrat. Both Mr. Kims want the other to stand down to avoid a split in the opposition vote.
Election fever has produced a remarkable demonstration of democracy for a nation with virtually no experience of the ballot box.
We must get real democracy, right? Democracy is from the bottom of the people, not from the top of the people.
This is the biggest moment in history, Korean history. It's very, very important.
But the election has aroused as much fear as fervor. The street protests which forced President Chun Doo-hwan to agree to this election back in June have re-emerged to haunt the candidates in a campaign dogged by violence, claims of cheating and bitter regional rivalries. Last week, No Tae-woo, the man Chun had hoped would succeed him, was chased out of Cholla province, the stronghold of opposition leader Kim Dae-jung, by stone-throwing mobs. Mr. No now campaigns for the government cocooned by plastic shields held by bodyguards trained in the martial arts. The ex-general tries to play down his military background, promising an end to authoritarian rule. Many doubt his sincerity. On state-controlled television, the news bulletins repeat the violence every night, as No Tae-woo warns how this typifies the instability an opposition victory would bring. Opponents claim this merely demonstrates media manipulation by the government. Evidence that No Tae-woo's rallies are bolstered by crowds paid or instructed to attend raise fears that the government will attempt to rig Wednesday's vote to ensure he wins. Kim Dae-jung, South Korea's best-known dissident, sees this as his last chance to overthrow the regime who persecuted and imprisoned him in the past. Though in Western terms he is only mildly left-wing, Korea's powerful military have long branded Kim Dae-jung as a dangerous radical and communist sympathizer. He's the last man they want as president, though he believes he can win. Fellow dissident Kim Young-sam, equally convinced he's the front-runner, today called on Kim Dae-jung to drop out of the race. He believes that would guarantee an opposition victory. Kim Young-sam's more moderate image could prove acceptable to the middle classes and the military. The generals are still an unknown factor. Their professed neutrality will be severely tested if the opposition win. Nobody knows how they'll react if they don't like the result. In a country with 600,000 troops that's been controlled by successive military dynasties, there has so far never been a peaceful handover of power. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10, Seoul.
France says it had every right to bring home for medical treatment one of the secret agents convicted of the sinking of the Greenpeace ship, the Rainbow Warrior. Alain Maffard was flown from the South Pacific island of Hao, where he and a second agent were serving a 3-year term. New Zealand says it's a blatant and outrageous breach of the agreement which exiled the two agents to Hao.
The sinking of the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbour, with the loss of one life, was an act of sabotage by French Secret Service agents. 2 of them were arrested and convicted in New Zealand, though in a later deal they were handed back to the French, who undertook to hold Alain Maffard and Dominique Prieur on a remote Pacific island for 3 years. Maffard's flight home to France today because of illness enraged the New Zealand Prime Minister, who had offered to send a doctor to the island.
The French action is a blatant and outrageous breach of the adjudication, the terms of which were accepted by the French.
But Jacques Chirac, the French premier, had a different interpretation.
Il avait été prévu que si l'un des 2 officiers concernés était malade, ou si, puisque l'un des 2 était une femme et mariée, elle était enceinte, il y aurait automatiquement retour en métropole.
Major Maffard is believed to be a patient at this military hospital in central Paris tonight, and the French have invited the New Zealand government to have a doctor verify the secret agent's illness. The Rainbow Warrior, scuttled just 3 days ago, has reopened the wounds between New Zealand and France. Mr. Longy is angry because he feels let down by the French, who gave him favourable terms for his country's lamb and butter as part of the deal over the bombers. But that was never popular with the public in New Zealand.
Cricket, Mike Gatting says he'll captain England in the 3rd test against Pakistan after getting the support of the England officials who flew out to meet him. Gatting had threatened to resign after the test at the County Cricket Board forced him to apologise to the umpire Shakur Rana for bad language. Pakistan has offered to bring in neutral Indian umpires for the last test.
The team, practising against locally organised leg spinners, could hardly believe the latest bizarre twist in this saga. The management could hardly refuse the offer after all the fuss they've made, though there was no certainty the Indian officials would turn up in time.
Yes, I gather at one stage they even suggested that English umpires might come out. Do you think that was a serious suggestion?
Well, they put it to me that they'd be happy to have any umpires, including those from England, but I opposed that because I think that would be unnecessarily contentious and certainly goes against, in any case, what I believe, which is to have umpires from countries other than those playing.
Meanwhile, a grim-faced captain went for his confrontation with the men from London. He was demanding a vote of confidence. The rest of the team arrived for a 2-hour session at which words were not minced. Afterwards, admissions of guilt all round, a warning that the team was hardly in the right mood to play a test, but a firm statement about Gatting.
The captain was given the assurance that he has the full backing of the board and there is no question of his being replaced.
So the crisis in the team at least seems to have reached a temporary truce. But with the Indian officials far from certain to turn up for the test match, the umpiring saga is almost certainly not over. Giles Smith, ITN Sport, Karachi.
Soccer, and in the FA Cup's 2nd round, tonight's replay between Bristol Rovers and VS Rugby was called off. The pitch was frozen. It'll be played on Thursday. And after extra time in their 2nd replay, Kidderminster 0, Maidstone 0. The 3rd replay will be on Wednesday.
A detachment of Chinese soldiers has gone on parade at an exhibition in London. They're part of the 2,000-year-old terracotta army discovered in the tomb of China's first emperor. They're still insured for only £15 million.
The exhibition includes 2 horses and 9 soldiers, each piece more than 2,000 years old. Exquisitely crafted, they are part of an army of 7,500, which the Queen saw when she visited China last year. Described as the 8th wonder of the world, they were only discovered in 1974, when workmen digging a well broke into an underground chamber, part of the tomb of the tyrannous first emperor of China, who was, allegedly, terrified of death. Their protection, he imagined, would save him from retribution in hell.
I'm extremely proud of the fact that I'm Chinese, especially in looking upon these wonderful treasures. For instance, one object which may not have been noticed by many people was that beautiful sword, which was coated with chromium to prevent it from rusting, and is sharp even now. Now, I know that chromium has been used in the modern world only after the mid-20th century, but in my country it was in use 2,200 years ago.
The exhibition will be open to the public until February. Joan Thurkettle, News at 10, Central London.
The main news again. Lord Whitelaw has had a slight stroke and is in hospital. The Queen has sent a message of sympathy.
Finally, the Duchess of York got her wings as a helicopter pilot today, and she completed the course in half the time her husband took.
She came in low over the barbed wire to a textbook landing. The call sign Dauphy, Duchess of York. The Duke, no mean pilot himself, on hand for the big occasion. Instructor Kevin Spotty Mulhern watched proudly as the Duke of York pinned on the Duchess's wings, though no one seemed sure if he'd pinned them in the right place.
I was surprised, and I'm overjoyed the fact that she's actually managed to do it so easily and so well. I'm constantly surprised by her. She does everything very well indeed.
I now know exactly what he's talking about when he goes out on the sorties, so that's what I wanted to achieve. So when he comes back in the evening and tells me what he's been doing, I now know what he's been doing.
Is he a good backseat passenger?
Yes.
Yes, he's a very good backseat passenger, actually.
You haven't given him any frights?
He didn't need the airsuit bag.
They haven't given me any frights, no, none at all.
No. I mean, I'm not... What do you think, Spotty, about my flying?
Let's put him on the spot.
The lady driver jokes came later. The Duchess took it all in her stride. Vernon Mann, News at 10, RAF Benson, Oxfordshire.
Wall Street took wing as well tonight. When last seen, it was up 65 points. That's it tonight. Good night.
Very good evening to you. Now look at the latest news from the Central region. The government has just announced that the West Midlands Police Force is to get an extra £1 million to increase manpower, but the Chief Constable, Geoffrey Deere, has called the news bleak and disappointing. He recently asked Mrs Thatcher for more than £1 million extra cash. A pensioner has been beaten with a wooden club as he slept in his special old people's bungalow. George Washington, who's 68, was bound and gagged, then repeatedly clubbed over the head at his warden-controlled home in Walsall. The thieves took just £20 he'd put aside to buy some Christmas presents. A motorist who knocked down and killed a 5-year-old girl has been jailed for 18 months. Jennifer Shaw was killed on a Pelican crossing in Birmingham last June. David Pearce, who's 31 and from West Bromwich, admitted causing death by reckless driving. The court heard how he'd attempted to commit suicide just before the accident. And a driver who killed a baby girl when he drove over a zebra crossing at more than 60 miles an hour has been jailed for 9 months. Emma Shearman's pushchair was dragged for 60 yards along the Coventry Road in Birmingham. A man was seriously injured this afternoon when a fire engine went out of control and crashed into his pickup truck in Warwickshire. The engine was answering an emergency call in Southam. It hit a car, then the truck, and ended up in a garden. The truck driver is in hospital with head and leg injuries. Doctors in Oxfordshire have taken out an advert in a newspaper warning people they'll die because of cuts in the health service. Nearly 300 doctors have signed the ad in today's Oxford Mail, saying cuts due to be carried out in the spring will lead to the death of some patients. And now the weather forecast for the central region. It'll be dry overnight with temperatures down to -3 Celsius, 27 Fahrenheit. Tomorrow will be cloudy but dry. That's it from the newsroom for now. Join me again for our next bulletin at 1 a.m.